is there a difference between outrage in media, offence taking? Is there a difference between that and nerd rage, between offence and dismay? Is it possible that the various woke scold problems with media have some sort of legitimacy, and that fan problems with media aren't legitimate? If there are differences, what are they? What justifies one particular side of the argument more than the other, or vice versa? A common refrain on the nerd resistance, as we might call it, the free speech side of media consumption, is just don't watch it then, or read it, or listen to it, or whatever else. If something offends you, just don't partake of it. But can this not be considered the other way too? If a new interpretation of old media, like He-Man or She-Ra or anything else that's being rebooted, Cowboy Bebop, can we not just ignore this new interpretation, this new spin, this skin suit wearing reboot of things that we love? Can't we equally just ignore that in the same way that we appeal to people to just ignore things that offend them because they don't have to partake in them? I do think about this stuff a lot. People don't believe me, but the positions that I hold are generally pretty well thought out, and I do challenge my own position, and I do take criticism to heart. And it's possible I'm just rationalizing my own position, my own camp, but I do think there is a difference, or there are differences, multiple, plural. I think the woke scold instinct, I'm just using that as like a catch-all term, don't get offended. I think the woke scold instinct is to censor things. And this comes from a place where they think media is a lot more powerful than it is. The media can be very powerful in a monoculture like North Korea, where the only thing you're ever exposed to is state propaganda, and you only ever receive one message. I think it can be very powerful in that instance. But I don't think in a pluralistic media landscape such as we have that it is that powerful. Of course, we do have the problem of people sealing themselves within media monocultures like Fox News or whatever, to be the classic example. But still, we do live in a pluralistic media landscape. It's not just one message being constantly hammered home, and never really has been. Even if one particular orthodox view has tended to dominate, there have always been other things. But it's vital that you stand against censorship for that pluralistic landscape to remain, where people can pick and choose and move amongst it. But they believe that media is that powerful. So their instinct to censor is coming from that belief that other people, not them, little people, peasants, who consume media are being brainwashed by it. Not them, of course. They can examine this media from a distance, and they're smart enough and clever enough and have enough willpower or whatever to resist its nefarious effects. It's a deeply patronising point of view, and while some people are stupid or gullible or easily led, I don't think you can apply that to society as a whole. But if you understand that outlook, then the urge to censor makes sense. The nerdly resistance to censorship, to woke scold censorship, it's not pro-censorship. There are right-wing people masquerading as free speech activists who do tend to end up outing themselves when they do support censorship. They masquerade as free speech advocates, but as I say, they constantly betray themselves. But the nerd resistance generally is not pro-censorship. It's pro-free speech. It doesn't tend to say that these things that the woke scolds want made should be censored. They will criticize, they will attack, they will resist, but they won't demand that it be removed or changed. And that's something we need to consider as well, the threat of change. Because these days we don't tend to own media, we stream it, we hire it, we lease it from the company, and if they change it, we can't get the old version anymore unless you happen to have it on archaic hard copy. So there are problems there we have to consider. Woke scolds have an overt and admitted agenda, a political one. And in their own media, because they believe the media is powerful, they tend to artlessly insert a great deal of propaganda. And there's a lot of confusion because people mistake an objection to propaganda as being an objection to the message of the propaganda. Like, if we go back to Gamergate, it was constantly and consistently painted as a right-wing reactionary movement that just hated women and gay people and whatever else. Yet the makeup of Gamergate was predominantly left libertarian on the political compass. So how do you square that circle? Well, because they were being misrepresented. The objection was not to female protagonists in video games or gay protagonists in video games or people of different races or whatever else. It was about the censorship and about the propagandization. Even a good message shoved down your throat, isn't welcome. Right? It's crude. It lacks art. Allegory, euphemism, metaphor. These are the tools to get your message across artistically and capably. And propaganda is a blunt instrument. So that's a big part of the problem, I think, is that it's not understood. Resistance to propaganda isn't resistance necessarily to the message of that propaganda. The propaganda can have a good message of diversity and inclusion and so on. Diversity for the sake of it is a different matter, but it's the act of propagandizing that people tend to object to. Because it makes you groan and roll your eyes, takes you out of the moment, breaks immersion, often leads to worse stories, and is, as I say, conducted artlessly, which is a subjective opinion, but I think most people can probably agree. And the resistance, the nerdly resistance, doesn't have an overt and admitted agenda, unless you count freedom of creativity, free expression as an agenda. I suppose you could, but when it comes to the effect on the art forms themselves, it doesn't have an effect. It's saying that we want this artist, we want this creator, we want this director, we want them off the leash and able to make something freely. So while you could, if you really want to be a pedant, you could argue that that is an agenda in and of itself, it doesn't affect the artwork. Woke scolds tend to reinterpret old media, to have no love or understanding of it, can't seem to admit that a lot of it was already progressive or ahead of its time, refuse to take historical context into consideration, and they shame and criticize these things and criticize the fans of it through deliberately subjective lenses, a racial lens, a gendered lens, whatever it might be. So they willfully and deliberately embrace subjectivity. Now, some subjectivity may be impossible to escape. We all have our own opinions, our own points of view, our own experiences, and so on, but embracing subjectivity and deriding objectivity, or not allowing people to have their own opinions on things, that's another matter. But the nerdly resistance does not tend to do that. You might take the piss out of someone if they like something that you think is trash, but there's an unspoken agreement that this is all subjective personal opinion. But the determination of whether a media form is worthy or not is whether it's any good. Now that's subjective. But if you go out looking for sexism, you're going to find sexism even where it doesn't exist. If you go out looking for racism, you're going to find racism even where it doesn't exist. And then there's the fact that the point of a lot of media has been to highlight sexism or racism or other things in order to say that it is bad, or to have a redemption arc, or to establish someone as a villain. And yeah, there's no nuanced understanding of those roles of bad ideas in media. If you're an existing fan of something, it's very hard to ignore that legacy and that thing you love being shat upon, and you being shat upon for the fact that you do love it. It's hard to ignore it being recontextualized. It makes it harder for you to enjoy the old media if you can even get hold of it anymore, and things being removed from streaming services or re-edited or digitally altered, as we mentioned earlier, makes that an issue. That old media people could just ignore and leave alone. And new media that they find offensive, they could just ignore or leave alone. But it's hard to ignore something you love being torn apart, misrepresented, and you as a fan of it being torn apart and misrepresented. It is a personal attack, often. Now, woke scolds and conservatives, lastly, have a double standard here. We can look at the latest fuss around the God of War franchise, where they have race-swapped a character from ancient Norse mythology. Now, I thought that was dumb as fuck when people got upset about it in Thor Marvel movies. But here, where they're trying to represent the semi-authentic view, it seems disrespectful to the mythology and legends and heritage of Northern Europe. Well, much of Europe, really. And if this was reversed, if this was a white Anansi, for example, the world would burn, Twitter would be aflame. And yet, people upset over this happening to a character from white European pre-Christian mythology being characterized as Nazis and whatever else. And that's an obvious and blatant double standard. And it's not just the woke scolds that have this double standard, it is the conservatives that tend to have this double standard, the ones who masquerade as free speech advocates, but are quick to turn around the other way and demand censorship if something offends them. I guess that's how you know someone isn't what they're claiming to be. The resistance does not have a double standard. They want their Nordic mythology characters to be of the appropriate type, and they don't want a westernized remake of Akira. Right? There's no double standard there. So there are differences. Profound differences. And so I'm confident in my own thought that I have picked the right side here. We can't ignore also there's a certain amount of cynical exploitation going on here. When you redo old properties, when you wokeify them, you are guaranteed outrage on social media and in the comments section of articles and so on, and so you generate buzz, and that gets people's interest, and people hate watch things. Tends to be a bit of a flash in the pan and to burn out quite quickly, but yeah, we are doing their marketing for them by being angry. Still, I think it's understandable that people talk about their childhoods being ruined because they're being recontextualized and they're being told that they're bad people for having liked the thing in the old days. So I think that's understandable. But woke scolds could just ignore things that they don't like if they didn't have this lunatic idea that these things really changed the world. I don't see a way through. Zhang.